Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. My name is Mary Langworthy, Public Programs Manager at the Moab Museum, and I'm delighted to be here today to share the story of William Grandstaff. William Grandstaff is arguably the first settler of Moab, and he was also a big deal early citizen of nearby Glenwood Springs, so we'll be talking a bit about his history. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have been to Moab? Excellent. For the folks in the audience that aren't familiar, get on I-70, head west for about 5 hours, and then we're 30 miles south, famous today for Arches National Park and other red rock beauties. And Glenwood, also featuring heavily in our story today, is just about an hour and a half west on I-70, just to set the stage a little bit. So as I said, William Grandstaff, big player in both Moab and in Glenwood. And the time period we'll be talking about is mid to late 1800s. And this community and those communities looked pretty different at that time, and he was really sort of the quintessential frontiersman, Western guy in a lot of ways. But he also sort of defied the expectations that we might have about that sort of folk, because Grandstaff was black and was likely born enslaved. So at the Moab Museum, our community has long kind of been curious about this guy, who we know was early settler, often referenced in oral histories, a big part of our public consciousness, as well as in Glenwood. And in the past few years, it's been my privilege to get to convene some researchers and folks who are really passionate about that story to dive in deeper and learn a lot more biographical details about this gentleman. So let's start at the beginning of his story. The research I'm going to be sharing here is really developed by Nick Sheedy, the lead genealogist of the PBS show Finding Your Roots, and also has, we've got a lot of research leads from the folks at the Glenwood Springs Historical Society, and also by sort of citizen historian, musician of all trades, Jerry Elias. So just wanted to start with a thanks to them, since the resources I'll be referencing have really come from a village. So Grandstaff, where did he come from? Where was he born? Seems like the most basic starting point of a biography, and it turns out it's really hard to figure out. This is sort of the murkiest part of the story. There's a bunch of census records. I've got copies of them up here, and they kind of point to different birthplaces. We have several records of his life indicating he was born in Virginia. We have a couple saying a couple other states in the South. What do we make of that? How do we stitch all of those together? It's when it's really helpful to have the lead genealogist of Finding Your Roots helping you out to sort of piece together that information and draw inferences and connect dots. Think like investigator with red ribbons on a bulletin board style. Basically, we think Grandstaff was born in the late 1830s or early 1840s. We know it was in the South. He doesn't show up on the 1850 census, so he's probably born enslaved. And then you look at a couple different records and say, all right, this one says he's from Alabama, this one says he's from Virginia. What do I do with all of this? Sort of the next step as a historian, as a genealogist, when you're looking at the history of Black Americans, is looking at slave owners with the same last name. It seems kind of weird to us today, but a lot of folks who were born enslaved ended up keeping the last name of the people who were enslaving them. So what we did was we looked for white families with slaves in those states and looked at the slave schedule of the U.S. Census and basically found that likely our guy, William Grandstaff, protagonist of today, was probably born in slavery in Virginia, in Shenandoah County, and held in slavery by this guy named George Grandstaff. And if you're like, whoa, you just said census analysis too many times, my eyes are glazing over, never fear. If you want to get into the weeds about genealogy, come see me after. I've got the documents and pages of analysis that led to that conclusion. But chapter 1, William Grandstaff, probably born enslaved in Virginia. Where does he end up next? Before he makes his way out west, he has a couple really interesting chapters as a young man. There's a lot of historical evidence that he lived in Cincinnati in the 1860s. We think he probably escaped from slavery or got out of slavery in like the 1850s because of when he starts showing up on records in Cincinnati. But we've got evidence that this young guy, like 20-something, young black man is living in Cincinnati, gets married, has a kid, is doing city things. There's some records of him having some different jobs, sort of bouncing around, finding his way. And one of the coolest records we have of him, of this chapter of his life, is as a member of Cincinnati's Black Brigade. There's a flag right here that says Black Brigade of Cincinnati that was presented to the brigade because they were a volunteer military operation. They were the first regiment of their kind in U.S. history, first group of Black Americans organized into the Union Army to fight against what they anticipated would be a Confederate attack coming. So that's what we have, like early 1860s. That's what our guy is up to. He's Company 1, Regiment A. There's like 44 guys, and he's like one of the very first. Pretty cool. Then he starts to not show up on city directories. He had married this woman named Isabella Grandstaff, and she shows up as a widow. So we're like, is this a totally different William Grandstaff? Did our guy die, and this isn't the same William Grandstaff that shows up out west and gets up to all these cool things? Not necessarily. Again, that's why helpful to have the professional genealogists with the red lines connecting all the dots of our story. Because in that time, getting separated, getting divorced, super significant stigma. So the genealogist had a interesting little note I'll read. He said, it should be noted that women who had been abandoned or divorced often reported that they were widowed to avoid a stigma when asked by census enumerators or people who compiled city directories. As such, we might take the widowed status with a grain of salt. So, probably didn't die. Probably is the same William Grandstaff that shows up out west a few years later. In the 1870 census, searched high and low, and the only record we have of this guy is he's living in Omaha. And he's living in a boarding house with a bunch of other people doing sort of wage work of a couple different varieties. And what do we make of this? I mean, you think about the context of what's happening in the world, the context of what's happening in the U.S. then. For guys like Grandstaff, who were born in slavery and separated from their families, they're kind of bouncing around and adjusting to a really different world than slavery conditions that they were born into. So it's something that historians see in the years after emancipation and Reconstruction is a lot of young Black folks moving around, maybe trying to reunite with family they had been separated from, or just trying to make their way in a world that's looking real different than it did a few decades ago. So that's what Grandstaff's up to as a young man. And then, late 1870s, he finally shows up in our time zone, makes his way out west. Again, a little regional historical context. 1870s is a pretty wild time to be in Colorado, wild time to be in Utah. You got a lot of folks trying to make a new go of it. For a lot of different reasons. Mining, the lure of ranching. The U.S. is giving away chunks of land if you can make a go of it and set up shop somewhere. There's a lot of opportunity to be had, particularly if you're a young man, which Grandstaff is. And he's kind of been floating around. And he makes his way to the Moab Valley in 1877. And in 1877, the Moab Valley is effectively Ute land. In 1855, there had been a really short-lived mission by the Mormon Church. They sent down a bunch of guys. Lasted a couple months. Not good interactions between the Mormon missionaries and the Ute, and they ran back to Salt Lake. So unlike a lot of Utah towns, Moab was not basically the outgrowth of a Mormon mission. And what we've got in the valley at that point is this abandoned stone fort from the mission. Ute people living seasonally between the La Salle Mountains, kind of in Moab's backyard, and the lower elevations in the winter. And Grandstaff shows up on the scene, says, this is kind of nice. We got a nice creek running through. If you've been to Moab, maybe you've been to Mill Creek. Glorious swimming hole, and adds some irrigation potential to get your garden going. He shows up with a guy known only to history today as Frenchie. It's a research project for me in the future, is who's that guy. There had been a bunch of French fur traders in the West in decades prior, so maybe that's where the nickname came from. We don't know. Anyway, Grandstaff and Frenchie show up 1877, each kind of lay claim to half of the Moab Valley. Moab Valley is as big as Manhattan, just aside for those of you who haven't been there, just kind of visualizing how big it is. And they're hanging out at the fort. A bunch of other people start showing up in the next few years while they're there. The town is officially platted, have their little grid laid out a couple years after in 1879. It starts getting buildings and the semblance of a main street around 1880. And that's kind of when there's a real influx. You see a lot of ranchers coming in, a lot of sheep kind of start around then. Sheep was big then too. And Grandstaff has a little herd of cattle that he is running in Grandstaff Canyon, if you've been there today. And it's a really nice piece of real estate. I said Mill Creek is nice. The creek in Grandstaff is one of very few in the region that flow year-round. So it's a great place if you've got 40-something head of cattle that you're trying to keep fed in a very dry and dusty place like Moab. So Grandstaff's laid claim to this. Oral histories say that other settlers were kind of looking at that and saying, that looks awfully nice. Nice canyon you got there. I might be interested. Anyway, things go south in 1881. It's kind of a rough year for Moab history. There was a violent conflict between the Ute living there and some settlers. There had been a bunch of allegations and finger pointing about missing cattle, and there was a big armed conflict, and a bunch of people on both sides died in the La Salles that year. Early settlers of Moab looked at Grandstaff and said, hey, you were selling alcohol to the Utes. Get out of here. The oral histories are really murky around here. It's really hard to substantiate rumors and allegations like that 100 and something years later, right? But what we know is that there was conflict, and Grandstaff leaves in a hurry in 1881 from Moab. Where to next? He's tried his hand at the cattle thing. He had to leave all his cattle behind because he was getting out of Moab so quickly. After being kind of the first non-native resident to make it more than a month or two there, he shows up in Colorado. He had a little stint in Salida, reportedly, and then he decides to settle in Glenwood Springs. Moab was getting its start kind of as a ranching town. Glenwood was underway as a mining town. So he's a frontiersman of all trades. He gets some mining claims. He starts working, trying to get some gold and silver. He gets a saloon and operates the Grandstaff Landing Saloon for a bit. There's newspapers kind of chronicling land sales. Old newspapers are great. They're like such a hoot to read if you ever need a pastime, because they're very gossipy too. So you hear like, oh, Grandstaff came to town to see friends, and you like hear about people's social circle in the newspaper. So we start getting like a more robust picture of this guy's life, and he's doing all the Wild West stuff. We got the saloon, we got the mining. He left the cows in Utah. It's like, what more do you want on a frontiersman resume? It's pretty. It's a bunch of very Western vocations, and he gets his cabin up on Red Mountain. He owned some of the hot springs at one point. Would have been a nice thing to hold on to. And he kind of sets up shop on the outskirts of town. A little bit of a recluse. He also likely had a wife named Rebecca. We can't find the marriage certificate, but she's listed as co-owner on a bunch of stuff. And then he's getting kind of old at this point, right? He's born 1830s. We're talking like 1890s now. The residents of Glenwood Springs refer to him in the newspaper as Old Portuguese, which is one of those things that stumped me, but the genealogist kind of looking into this said that might be a nod to a biracial background. Sometimes, apparently, mixed race black folks might find benefit in claiming to be Portuguese, because race relations of the time, that was easier in some cases. So anyway, he's recorded on the census as black, but a lot of people in the newspaper are talking about him as Portuguese. Kind of funky, little aside. And then in 1901 is where the timeline of his life finally ends. He died in 1901 at his cabin, and what we've got so far is a record of his life kind of built around all these documents. We're drawing lines between censuses. We're looking at land deeds, all this sort of sterile, like cut and dry genealogy stuff. And I think kind of the account of his passing is one of the more human snapshots into his life. So I've got a little bit to read from the Avalanche Echo newspaper, best newspaper name ever, from August 22nd, 1901. So that's 122 years ago yesterday. The title of it was A Most Gruesome Find. And basically they had sent some friends up to check on Old Portuguese up at the cabin. Haven't seen him in town in a while. Is he doing all right? He was not. He had died of natural causes. But here's what they said. It was very poetic. Again, old newspapers are a blast. The old man lived a solitary life on the top of the mountain where he had several mining claims which he had been working for the past 6 or 7 years. He was accustomed to making regular trips to this town for the purpose of obtaining fresh provisions and visiting his friends, and when his absence became prolonged, they became alarmed. So then a bunch of his friends who went up to check on him and found he was not well, or very not well, all the way not well, were sort of like went back and arranged for funeral services and got the deacon and got everyone that you need to bury someone. This, I feel like, just sounds like a poetry. Old Deacon Jones wandered quietly away from the balance of the party. Just as Mr. Bullis was about to begin the burial service, Jones reappeared in a very unobtrusive manner and gently placed a bouquet of beautiful wildflowers. This little act of esteem was so in contrast to the other unfortunate conditions that it brought the tears to the eyes of the onlookers, who mutely completed the burial and returned home impressed with the beauty of this touching evidence of brotherly affection. Yeah, it's poetic, and we have so many pieces of record that we've pulled together that are so dry and sterile and give us the bones of this guy's life, but this is like, he was loved, he was part of a community. I think that's my favorite of, the pieces of evidence that we've pulled together about him. So that's where the timeline of his life ends. He's really the first non-native resident of Moab, and then he becomes a really versatile player in Glenwood Springs, and has this backstory before that's really varied. Born enslaved, makes his way to Cincinnati and is part of the first group of Black Americans fighting for the freedom of Black Americans in the U.S. It's a lot of chapters. It's a lot of really interesting pieces. And his legacy has definitely lasted a lot longer and taken many forms in both Moab and in Glenwood. In Glenwood, part of that newspaper article I didn't read was his friends fashioned a tree next to his cabin where he was buried into a big cross. And that stood for many decades, and then it fell down. And then the Glenwood Springs Electric Department put up a replacement cross that was lit for many years. And then there was a whole thing in the 1990s. Some local citizens in the ACLU were objecting to having a religious symbol on public property, so they took that cross down. But then someone else put up a cross really close by on a private easement. And the Red Mountain Cross Preservation Association still exists today. There's still a cross, and it's still lit, and you can still see it from Glenwood. So, kind of crazy. There's also a hiking trail named for him with some interpretive signage about him and his various roles in the community nearby. Moab's had some friction dealing with Grandstaff's legacy in the community. The canyon where he ran his cattle in Moab was referred to as N-word Canyon colloquially and on official government maps up until the 1950s. Then it became Negro Bill Canyon. And then in 2017, there was a ton of debate, and they changed the name to Grandstaff Canyon. And it's managed by the BLM. There's interpretive signage out there. And I guess I say there's friction just because figuring out how to name the canyon to honor this guy as, like, arguably Moab's first settler, and acknowledging his racial background has just been, like, a topic of debate there. But today there's an interpretive plaque at that trailhead, and it is one of the most popular Moab hikes outside of the parks. Gets thousands and thousands of visitors every year. So next time you're in town, come check it out and know that that's where he ran his cattle. So everything I shared has been sort of the effort of a bunch of folks in Moab, in Glenwood, who were just really curious about this early settler and wanted to piece together his timeline more thoroughly. We had kind of known about the Moab pieces, we had kind of known about the Glenwood pieces, but figuring out where he was from was really took a bunch of folks weighing in over the past few years and aggregating a lot of these documents that I have up here for the history nerds. Come see me after, and we can take a peek at them. So we know the biographical details, but like, why does this matter? Why is this cool? I mean, on one hand, it's really cool because this guy is like first non-native resident of Moab. This guy is early entrepreneur in Glenwood. It's also really interesting because he's Black, and that's not something people maybe think of when they're thinking of frontiersmen and pioneers and cowboys. So I wanted to conclude with just kind of giving you a little window into my job at the museum. I'm convening all these people, finding out this cool research, coming up with a stack of cool documents, and getting the story in a row. But they're not really charismatic artifacts. We don't have any photos. We don't have any objects that were his. How do we turn this story into an exhibit for the museum, which is something I was tasked with. And kind of what I opted to do was to design an abbreviated timeline of what I just shared, saying, all right, Moab's first settler, here's where he came from, here's all the chapters. And then also I selected 4 just quintessential frontiersman artifacts from our collection that did not have provenience. And provenience is museum speak for, we don't know where that came from. So I brought them here. We brought a branding iron, a horseshoe, a spur, and a gold pan, just very like Western ephemera type of stuff. We know that a collector bought these all around the West at estate sales and then donated a big batch to the Moab Museum, where they helped fill out display cases as props, add a little texture. And we don't know where they came from, which kind of stinks in terms of telling a regionally relevant story at a museum. But we know that 1 in 4 cowboys in the U.S. in Grandstaff's time were Black. And that surprised me when I learned it. I've watched plenty of John Wayne, and that's kind of the cowboy in my mind. Like, I don't know. I see this, and I'm picturing like a super chiseled white guy with a great jawline. And turns out cowboys are a lot more diverse. And that was something I didn't know, and Grandstaff is an example of that. And that's just pretty darn cool. So designing the exhibit, we picked 4 of these like really generic Western artifacts and then sort of posed that as a little fact that statistically 1 in 4 of these should have been used by a Black cowboy. So yeah, that's a little window into my job. And also the exhibit kind of sought to contextualize Grandstaff's story. Like, all right, we got this cool, really versatile frontiersman guy that had all these fun, wild adventures. Is this totally anomalous? Is he like the only Black guy in the West? No. And there's a bunch more research and sort of attention and scholarship being paid to those stories. These days, I've got some really cool books for folks that are interested. Several researchers and scholars at USU and other universities in the West have sort of been elevating and finding these stories of Black frontiersmen. There's a couple really cool museums that I want to plug too. Over in Denver, the Black American West Museum and Heritage Center is doing a lot of research specifically about Black history of folks post-Civil War coming and making a go of it in the West. There's also an annual rodeo, the Bill Pickett Rodeo, specifically run by Black cowboys, kind of reclaiming that piece of history that we don't think about because we think about John Wayne instead. And that's a really cool event that happens every year. And even a couple of folks were asking me, Mary, why do you have a National Geographic with an iceberg on the table? For the first time the other day, I actually learned about Black cowboys on accident, picking up a copy of National Geographic, because there's a whole article about sort of this chapter of history and a bunch of different organizations that are working with kids today, connecting Black youth in LA with cowboy history with the Compton Cowboys, and other cool projects like that. So, not a totally random story. William Grandstaff was one of many Black Americans sort of seeking new opportunity out west. Not just the John Waynes. Thanks so much.